Hello and welcome back. This is going to be my second video in this Biostatistics series. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about how a research question is answered, from the start of proposing the question all the way to drawing our final conclusion. So if you remember in the last video, I talked a little bit about how a biostatistician's job is not only to conduct hypothesis tests. Rather, they need to be involved in the whole process from start to finish. In this video, I also plan to go into detail about the study design types that we have at our disposal to help answer our research question. So what I have on the screen now is kind of a framework for how a research study is conducted. So now let's take a look at the first step. This is to conduct an appropriate study, and there are many different types to choose from. Going back to our framework, the biggest division here is of observational studies versus experimental studies. So an observational study is when a researcher does not manipulate any variables, rather they just kind of observe how the world works when it's already naturally set up. An experiment, on the other hand, is when an independent variable is specifically manipulated by an experimenter, and the effect on a dependent variable is observed. So let me give you an example to help illustrate this. Suppose we want to answer the question, is smoking associated with lung cancer? In the observational study version, we would randomly sample from a group of people that we already know to be smokers, along with non-smoker controls. After a follow-up period, we can calculate rates of lung cancer within both groups and then compare them. In an experiment, however, we are going to be the ones who manipulate the smoking status. So that means we are going to be assigning people to be smokers or non-smokers, and then compare how the two groups do after a follow-up period. Now, obviously, this is a situation where an observational study is preferable over an experiment due to the ethical concerns of manipulating somebody's smoking status. But now that we've understood the difference between an observational study and an experiment, let's return to our framework. Now, you'll actually notice that the steps in conducting observational studies and experiments are quite similar. We're going to go through the same process of randomly sampling, collecting data, and hypothesis testing to reach our conclusion. The only additional step in an experiment is this random assignment step, and I'm actually going to mark this with an asterisk, because this step is only applicable in certain cases. Specifically, an RCT or randomized control trial will use random assignment, but a quasi-experimental design will not. So without further ado, let's discuss each of these studies listed in blue. We'll start with our observational studies. The first one I'm going to discuss is a cohort study, and the word cohort just means group. So a cohort study looks at two or more groups of people who are similar in some way. Think of this as having a similar exposure or independent variable. And essentially what we're going to do in the study is track each cohort to determine their outcome or dependent variable. A good example of this is the observational study version of the smoking example that we were discussing earlier. This is actually a cohort study since we have two groups, which are known smokers and known non-smokers, and so we're considering smoking the exposure, and we're following up after a period of time to determine their outcome, which is if they have lung cancer or not. So this would be a cohort study, and this is different from a case control study because in case control studies, the outcome has already happened. So what we have is two groups, one with the outcome of interest and one without the outcome of interest. And then we're going to be looking back in time for each group to see if they were exposed. So going back to our smoking and lung cancer example, one way we could design a case control study is if we take a group of people that we already know to have lung cancer, along with matched controls who do not have lung cancer, and look back in time for each participant in each group to see if they were smokers or not. Then, we would compare the rates of smoking exposure in both groups. Our last type of observational study is the cross-sectional study. What's important to remember here is that all the data that we're going to be collecting will be at a single time point, which is going to be in the present. So we're not going to be doing any follow-ups or looking back in time to gather data. Rather, this is just a single one-time snapshot of the present. And to illustrate this again with our example of smoking and lung cancer, we're going to be measuring the exposure, which is the smoking status, and outcome variable, which is the presence of lung cancer, at the same time. So we can take all the people in this study and fill out this two-way table, reporting yes or no for smoking and yes or no for the presence of lung cancer, so that we can get a count for each box. And based on our numbers, we can determine if there's an association. So those are our 3 observational studies. Now let's talk about our experimental studies. We have RCTs, or randomized control trials, which I touched on in the last video, and we have quasi-experimental designs. So again, for experiments, we're going to have an independent variable that we manipulate to determine its effect on a dependent variable. In doing so, we need to assign subjects to a treatment group, or groups, plural, and a control group. And the difference between the RCT and the quasi-experiment is how we assign these groups. In an RCT, we assign subjects to treatment groups randomly, while in quasi-experiment, we do so based on non-random criteria. So this means that if we were to assign people to the smokers group and non-smokers group based on coin flip, then this experiment would be an RCT, because coin flip is a method of random assignment. However, if we assign people based on, say, their gender, so having men assigned to the smoking group and women assigned to the non-smoking group, then we would be conducting a quasi-experiment. So it is important to remember that when it comes to experimental studies, there's a strong preference for RCTs over quasi-experimental designs when it comes to clinical research, and you often see RCTs employed in testing the effects of a novel drug or a new medical intervention. So moving forward, when I discuss experimental studies, I'm primarily going to be talking about RCTs. So now that we know about the different types of studies that are able to be conducted, let's talk about how to decide what study to conduct to answer a research question. And in order to do this, we need to really weigh the pros and cons of observational studies versus experimental studies. So observational studies can give us real insight into if there's an association between 2 variables, such as smoking and the presence of lung cancer. So one of the benefits of conducting an observational study over an experimental study is that you can gain valuable information while oftentimes not having to worry about factors such as ethical issues that can make it hard to conduct an experiment sometimes. The benefit of an experimental study, however, is that if conducted correctly, we will not only be able to determine if there's an association between 2 variables, but we can also establish causation. So if we get data that supports it, we can conclude that smoking causes lung cancer, rather than just concluding that smoking is associated with lung cancer. Remember, correlation does not equal causation. And there is value in establishing causation, because if we know that smoking causes lung cancer, rather than simply knowing that it has an association with lung cancer, then we are able to make more informed public policy as a result of that extra information. Thus, when deciding which study to conduct, first determine if an experiment can be conducted based on the resources that you have available, and importantly, if it is ethical to do so. If an experiment cannot be done, be aware that you will only be determining if there is a correlation and not causation between 2 variables when choosing to conduct an observational study such as a cohort, case control, or cross-sectional study. And I would also note that in determining the specific type of experiment to conduct, again, I would reiterate that RCTs are significantly better than quasi-experiments because more randomization reduces the effects of confounding variables, allowing for more robust causal conclusions to be drawn in RCTs. So hopefully you found this video helpful in understanding this framework of conducting a biostatistical study and understanding the options of studies that we have to help answer a research question. In the next video, I will talk about random sampling, which is actually the next step in our framework, but nonetheless an important part of a biostatistician's job of drawing a sound conclusion. With that said, I will end this video here and see you guys in the next one. Thank you for watching.